who is going to start off our author chat by just introducing himself and telling us a little bit about his latest book, if that's okay.
Okay. That's my name's Peter Robinson. The latest book in the Banks series is called Not Dark Yet, and the title's taken from a Bob Dylan song, which some of you may well know. A number of people who've read it have already told me that it actually is pretty dark, but I still think it's quite a nice title. It captures something of the mood of the book. It's, I think, number 27 in a pretty long-running series, which makes me feel old to say. And the third in a kind of a loosely knit trilogy, each one of which is separate in itself, but together tell an extra story. So that's how it works. And I'm just here to answer your questions tonight. And I hope we can all just relax and enjoy ourselves.
Yeah, we definitely will. So you were saying about Not Dark Yet being the title of a Dylan song. And one of the strong themes for me from reading through the Banks books is his love of music. And that's really prevalent all the way through, isn't it? Like what he's listening to and things. Does that reflect your love of music?
It does to some extent. It's both me and, you know, some characterization for Banks. I wanted, when I first started writing, you know, which was in the early 80s, there were a few detectives about that liked music, like Morse, for example. And then John Harvey's Resnick came out a little bit later. But, you know, Morse was opera and Resnick was jazz. And I didn't want Banks to be stuck on one particular kind of music. So I gave him very broad tastes, which I have myself. So it's enabled me to indulge myself over the years by putting a lot of my favorite stuff into the character. And some people don't like it. Fair enough. There probably was a little bit too much in Not Safe After Dark. It's a very long playlist. But, you know, if you don't like it, just skip it and carry on reading.
I was going to ask if you actually have sort of playlists or things available for people to go and listen to the music that's mentioned in the books.
Well, we're a little bit behind. At least we started doing it rather late and haven't caught up with all the earlier books. But there are a number of playlists on the website, which is just called inspectorbanks.com. So if you go there, there'll be a section of playlists, and it's got quite a few of them on, mostly the more recent books, and one or two of the old ones. And are actually connect with Spotify or with one of the streaming systems too. Not all of them, but some of them.
Excellent. So my dad had a question before we went live. He's called David. He said, which is your favorite Banks book?
Oh, that's kind of asking like who your favorite child is, you know, your favorite daughter or son, except that books can't sort of beat you up if you say the wrong one, I suppose. It's difficult to choose. I've always been very fond of In a Dry Season, which I think was the 10th book in the series, simply because it went a bit further than the ones before. It marked a change for me, you know, I guess a jump forward, in that I included a lot of other points of view, a story from the past impinging on the present. Plus, it was the first one in which Banks was divorced. Not that makes it a particularly good one for him, but it gave the character quite a lot more freedom in future books too. So there was a total change in Banks's life and a sort of leap in the style that I was using, you know, that I could include more. Before that, the books were quite a bit shorter and tended just to concentrate mostly on plot. So In a Dry Season, I guess, but I could name others. You asked for one, that'll do.
No, I'm just going to go and have a look at the one that my dad said, because I think he said underneath that In a Dry Season was his favourite.
Did he indeed? Well, good for David.
I'm intrigued by the globe-trotting bit of Banks. So when I came to see you talk in Leeds, I think you'd just written a book where they'd gone to Tallinn.
Yes.
Which was one of the things that inspired me to visit the city because you made it sound so nice. And in the one I'm reading at the moment, there's a visit to Moldova. Are they all places that you've been yourself?
Yes, well, that was Watching the Dark, I think it was Tallinn. I was fortunate enough to be invited to teach a summer school there a few years ago. So I spent nearly about 2 weeks sort of living in an apartment in the old town and sort of walking every day a couple of miles to the university and teaching a writing course in English. I hasten to add, I don't speak Estonian. And it was great. I loved the place and did a lot of exploring and found some really interesting places, including the old ruined prison that I thought would be perfect for crime stories. So I had to figure out a way of getting Banks there. And seeing as it was a place I'd spent some time in, I took a lot of pictures. I made a lot of notes, so I was able to recreate it quite well in the books. So I enjoy doing that. I mean, most places I go to, I will take a lot of pictures and I will write down a lot of notes so that if I ever do use it, then it's there.
Excellent. And so Moldova, is that a place you visited as well?
Now that's interesting because I had a couple of trips to Croatia for the Zelda stuff, to find a place where she might live or know somebody and travel to. And I was intending to go to, I still can't pronounce it, Chisinau, the capital of Moldova. But what happened, well, you know what happened, the pandemic happened and it wasn't possible to go anywhere. So for the first time ever, I had to create a city that I hadn't been to. And that was challenging, but maybe it worked out, especially if the reader hasn't been there. You might believe me.
I believed you. It's very atmospheric, the description. I've just read to the bit. I've just got past her visit there, and not dark yet, and it felt very atmospheric and almost like you would imagine that kind of place would be. So I believe that you'd been there.
Well, that's good. That's good. I've managed to convince someone.
So Zelda, one of the characters in the book, is a super recognizer. Let's tell our viewers a little bit about what a super recognizer is.
Well, it's something I came across, just in general reading. I think there's probably an article in a magazine or a newspaper that they do exist, that people who never forget a face. And, we talk about that. People will tell you, oh, I never forget a face. And they do forget most of them, but some people actually don't. And it's something that's innate. It can't really be taught. And if you have that skill, it's, well, both a blessing and a curse, as Zelda realizes. Sometimes if you've had a tough life, the last thing you want to do is remember every face that's helped to give it to you. But at the same time, it could be a useful skill, and the police have used it in the UK quite a bit. They used super recognizers in the Skripal poisoning case in Salisbury, and there are several people with that skill employed by the Metropolitan Police. So it just seemed, it would be an interesting idea to have somebody who'd been through the life she had. Obviously, she'd seen in her time a lot of criminals, traffickers, various people in the drug business and whatever, and that if she could remember faces, then she would be useful to the National Crime Agency, spotting people coming over the borders at the airports, train stations, and from surveillance photographs. So that's how it really started.
So when you choose to write about something like that, or give a character something like that, where would you then leap off from? How much research do you do into that kind of thing before you put it into your book?
Well, you do as much as you can, and I never met one, so I wasn't able to talk to one. But there's a lot of stuff in psychology books, and obviously you can find stuff on the internet. And basically, but I think always for me, a lot of working in of research is imagination. You talk about writing about Moldova, never having been there. I take the information, I watch films, read books, get the history, watch travelogues, look at pictures, read accounts, first-hand accounts if there are any. And it all goes in there, and then it kind of mixes up and comes out through the imagination, which makes it obviously a little removed from reality, but enough to still be believable and also to be interesting, I would hope. So the problem with research, of course, is just not putting it all in. You find out about a subject and you get tons and tons of stuff, and you think, oh, that's neat. I've got to put that in and put that in. And suddenly your book's weighted down, with information and research. So then you've got to go back and cut it all out again. So I tend to put it through the imagination first, so I don't have to edit it out so much.
I've got so many of my own questions for you, but I'm going to start asking you some of the ones that are coming in from the side, so I don't just monopolise you.
I'd have to put my glasses on to read them.
Okay. Jason Kelly says, you've been writing for over 30 years. Has your writing routine changed much over those?
Yeah, it's changed a lot, actually. When I started, it used to be a papyrus scroll and a quill pen, or at least it feels that way. I actually started on a typewriter, manual typewriter, which meant retyping drafts. And what I used to do when I first started was to write as fast as I could through the first draft without looking back, mistakes and everything. Even if I had second thoughts, I would just keep going. And I'd end up with 200 or 300 pages of stuff that needed editing. And then I'd have to go through it with a pen, make notes, type it again, probably do that 3 or 4 times. It was very, very time consuming. But when I moved on to a computer later in the 80s, the word processing programs do a lot of the editing for you, in that they make it easy to cut, to add, to move. And those basic things are what you do in editing. So it got rid of that, the need to type it out 3 times. So what I found myself doing was, each day I start, I'd probably go back over the previous day's work and make some changes, move things around a little bit. So as I go, I do most of the editing, like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, so that what I end up with is closer to, the final version than it used to be. It doesn't need redoing again and again and again and again. So yeah, I certainly using a computer has changed that aspect of my working. It doesn't change the fact that I still don't outline or organize my plots in advance, and I still have to do editing. I still make a lot of notes in hand in a notebook, which hasn't changed at all over the years.
So do you have, when you've come up with an idea for a new Banks story, do you have any sort of planning in advance, or do you just get going and write?
I really just get going. Usually what I need to kickstart me is a very strong visual idea of usually the opening scene, which is quite often finding a body in a beautiful place in Yorkshire. So I imagine that scene, and I just get to the point where I really have to start writing it. And then that leads to other scenes. It's just a matter of, it's almost like the way a plant grows. You write a scene, a body's found, Banks goes out to see what's happening. There's a human being there, and in some ways that victim is the most important character in the book, because the whole of the rest of the book is telling that person's story, hoping to get to the point of why this happened and how this happened. So you ask questions, as Banks would. He goes, who is this, first of all? Got to try and figure out who's dead. Who were the friends, possible enemies? What was the workplace environment? What had this person done that might have resulted in anyone feeling strong enough to kill him or her? And then as soon as you get some names and some ideas, you find that each little scene asks questions that lead to another scene, and it develops like that. But until, of course, you get stuck, which I always do. you run into a brick wall. Oh dear, what do I do now? And then you may have to go back and change one or two things. But it's still the most exciting way to work. I don't get bored working like that, where I would if I was just joining the dots in an outline.
What do you do when you do get stuck? So when you've written yourself into that brick wall?
Go to the pub, which I can't do at the moment, so I better not get stuck. You basically just do something else, maybe go away from it for a day or two, go for a walk, go for in Yorkshire, I go for a walk up in the Dales. Here I can walk down by the lake. Or, when places were open, I would perhaps go for an extra long lunch and with friends and stay out, or go to the pub. Yeah, I mean, all of those things, just get away from it for a while and stop, sitting at the computer feeling really frustrated, because it doesn't do me any good to do that. Just go away. And usually, I mean, I've been lucky. It's never lasted more than a day or two. Usually I've got back to it. I've had an idea. I think, okay, that'll do it. I've got to go back and like change this thing that I didn't want to change because I liked it, but it's got to go. And then the rest will work. So solving problems is just problem solving, really.
So you were talking about the beautiful locations in Yorkshire that you use to kind of leave places. And you've got a mixture of kind of real locations in the book, haven't you? And like some things that are kind of invented.
Mm.
Why did you choose to invent some of them? Is it just sort of fictional license, or?
Yeah, and actually they're all real. They're just not where they are in real geographical terms. I moved things, okay? So I took a lot of my favorite places in the Yorkshire Dales, from Wensleydale, Wharfdale, Swaledale, Weardale even, and just put them into a dale I called Swainsdale. East Vale is a mix of Richmond and Ripon, even a little Thirsk, Northallerton, those North Yorkshire towns. But even though it doesn't exist, it's near Harrogate, it's near York, it's near Ripon. So Banks can go to those places. And Leeds, of course, he goes to Leeds quite a lot. And it was interesting that when they did the TV series, they chose to set most of that in Leeds in the later episodes. So he kind of switched from being a North Yorkshire copper to a West Yorkshire one.
Did they just choose to set it in Leeds for the later episodes because the sort of convenience for all the filming?
Yeah, basically. It was easier. Yeah, because I mean, it's a whole lot of people, and they have to travel a long way. I mean, they did some of the ones up near Harrogate, and but they had to be within a reasonably short drive to get back to Leeds, because they filmed till quite late, and the costs would just skyrocket if they had to put everyone up in Harrogate, And I thought it should have been done in Richmond, because East Vale's very much like that with the market square and everything. But for some reason, that was way too far. They couldn't easily get there and back in a day. So Otley was one of the main places they used, and around Blubberhouses and just outside Harrogate way, and Bradford and Leeds.
Sam says your work's been translated into so many languages already. Have you been surprised by any of them? And are there more on your wish list?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are always some. I'm a bit surprised by languages that I can't even read the letters of, like Thai or Chinese. The Japanese were the first ones that surprised me, because they started quite early on, and their books are much smaller, and you read from the back, and it's sort of rows of characters, and they have quite distinctive covers in that they'll do a sort of Chinese version of North Yorkshire, which looks really weird. And so they were always fun to get. Now there aren't so many. I mean, I do well in Sweden, especially Poland, and some of the other European markets like France and Germany have shrunk a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting seeing, you know, the actual physical copy of your book.
Oh, got a frozen pizza.
Have we cut out there?
We have. I think you're back now.
Ah, okay. Probably the internet connection is it's not that great always here.
How are your sort of sales and sort of author events in your kind of adopted home of Canada?
Oh, they're very good. Yeah, I mean, I did reasonably well here before I was much known anywhere else. In the books were originally published by Penguin Canada, and they sort of shipped a few over to England and well, UK in general, but nobody really did much with them. You know, I think they mostly sat on the warehouse floor. And it was another reason I'm quite pleased with In a Dry Season was that was the first book that really had a kind of breakthrough in the UK, that the publishers actually put something behind it and gave it some promotion. So Canada's always been a steady market. I mean, it's not, the thing about Canada is that it prides itself on being a very literary country. So we have like Margaret Atwood and you know, writers of that level, literary writers who don't usually get very famous, as Margaret Atwood has done. You know, Michael Ondaatje, for example. But they tend not, Canada tends not to value genre writers, crime writers so much. And we have a lot of good ones that tend to be better known. You could really count on the fingers of one hand, you know, the Canadian crime writers who are known internationally. And we don't do as well here. I mean, we do all right, but, you know, we're kind of the middle of the top 10 rather than way up there. And it's just a Canadian sort of way of looking a little bit down on its own genre writers, but kind of buying carloads of American and British crime writers, but not Canadian ones. Luckily, I fall somewhere in between, or that's either good or bad. It depends. Sometimes it varies. Yeah. But it's a strange market here.
Yeah, it sounds it. Do you read many Canadian crime writers?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's such a small field. I mean, we all know each other. Like Louise Penny, Giles Blunt, and you know, have been very successful overseas as well as in Canada. And yeah, Linwood Barclay is another example. I mean, I think he set his books a little bit over the border in the States, because another problem was that Canadian settings were generally not very sellable overseas until really Louise Penny's books, which, you know, has made quite a lot of the Canadian setting. So quite a lot of Canadian writers set their books in the States, or I set them in England because that's where I'm from. But yeah, we all know each other. We don't, oddly enough, we don't see each other that often, though we live in the same city much of the time. We're all traveling a lot, and these days none of us are going anywhere.
I can imagine. There's a question on the stream that says, have you got any more standalone novels in the pipeline?
Yes, I hope to do one in the near future. The last year or so, it seems that the effect of this pandemic on my work was okay at first, because I was finishing off Not Dark Yet. So I was well into that, and then I had to do the editing of that. That took me up until last summer. Since then, I've not been able to really concentrate or focus for any great length of time. So what's happened is that I've developed about 2 or 3 ideas for books I'd like to write, but I just can't seem to sit down and write them, you know, for long enough to write a chapter or certainly a novel. So I do have some ideas for a standalone, and I'm actually working on another Banks one now. It's going slowly, but it's going. And when that's done, which we hope will be done in time to come out next year, then I think I'll get to work on the next standalone. Anything to avoid having to write about 2020 or 2021. We'll go back in the past.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you would write, because we've asked a lot of our writers this, especially when they write kind of a very current series. Is it something you would write about? Would you
No,
down and things in your books?
no, not yet. I mean, who'd want to read it? I certainly wouldn't. I think, by the time it's over, although it's going to be with us in some ways, I think for a long time to come, people are not going to want to read books that are set there. For crime writers, there is a great opportunity in that the unusual conditions of life can give you all kinds of ideas for alibis and various ways of sneaking around, being seen or not seen. There's a lot of opportunity for a clever crime novel in there, but I'm not going to be the one who does it. I don't think. I'm going to go back to the past. So
fair enough.
Eventually it'll catch up with me. Who knows, in 2 or 3 years' time. But I mean, the problem is for people who were writing stuff when all this began, that it's really terrible for them, because you cannot ignore it. You cannot write a book set in the last year and a bit without referring to it. And in the future, it's going to be, you can't just pick up as if it never happened somehow or other, because it is going to be with us in certain ways. You're going to have to refer to it. So it's really, I mean, this is nothing in terms of what it's done to families and to people, but it has caused a bit of a ruckus in the writing community, I think.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to hear people's responses about it, because some people have kind of had to embrace it, like you say, because they're writing their books now and they can't really ignore it. So they are writing about it. But then other people are like, well, even if my books are set now, I'm not going to write about it because I don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to read it. So I'm not sure what the right answer is.
I don't think there is one. I think we'll wait and see, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out in the next 2 or 3 years, and what relation it has to what's happening. I honestly wouldn't want to write a book about Banks going around trying to investigate a murder in the midst of all this. And, what are you going to do? You'd have to keep wearing it, you'd have to keep putting his mask on and off, and worrying about distancing and everything. So I mean, it's it wouldn't make for an interesting book. You'd have to put so much detail in, because if you hadn't done it, people would know that you left it out on purpose. It just wouldn't ring true. So that, I mean, it's going to be a problem. I don't know what we're all going to do in the future, but we'll find out.
So sticking with the sort of Not Dark Yet and the kind of overarching sort of 3 books that cover this story arc, and there's some quite dark themes in there of like trafficking and things like that. Is there sort of topics that you wouldn't approach in a crime novel?
I've never thought about writing in terms like that. I mean, maybe there are, I think that after 27 books, if I haven't done it, I'm not going to do it. I would have done it by now. So there are things that I haven't done in there, like murders of very young children is an obvious example, or sexual assault of very young children. It's not been a theme in my books. It may have been in the background because of some of the other characters in the books, but it's not been a major theme. And I haven't chosen deliberately, not to do that, but obviously something about it and something about me has just made it not a viable theme for me to write about. So there must be some things, other things there, but I don't really know what they are.
Fair enough. Oh, what other questions have got on the stream? So Sam wants to know if you feel nervous before each release, even though you've got 27 or more books out. Actually, how many books have you got out? Because there's 27 Banks.
Yeah, there's three standalones and 2 collections of short stories. It's over 30 altogether, isn't it? Yes, I mean, yes, of course. I feel nervous and excited as well. I mean, it's still a thrill to get that first copy and open it and sniff it, and smells like a fresh new book. It's nothing, is more exciting than that. Not being on the internet, ebooks and whatever. Always at that first hardcover. So that's always going to be an excitement. But then I don't honestly worry that much about reviews. I for the most part, I don't read them unless I come across them in papers I'm reading or something. I probably would. So I'm not terribly worried about general reception. And if my publishers are happy, then I'm happy with what I'm doing, then everything's reasonably okay.
Do you have like a go-to way that you celebrate each release? Do you go out for a meal, have a nice glass of wine?
Well, champagne usually. Yeah. A real glass of nice champagne. Problem is, though, that I finish so many times, and we've got to the point where we're saying, okay, I finished, which is really the first draft. It's close enough to a final draft, but it's the first draft. Right, we'll have the champagne. Then it comes back from the copy to the editor, and I go through it, and I finish the edited version and send that away. And I finished it again. Another bottle of champagne. So it gets very expensive finishing a book.
One of our members, Gillian Morris, says, "Are you a real ale and whiskey fan?"
I'm a real ale fan when I can get it. I'm not the sort that would travel miles for a particular pub, but I mean, I'm very fortunate in Richmond when I'm over in Yorkshire that we have a good selection of, if not necessarily real ales, like not small sort of brewery things. We do have Black Sheep, and we've got Timothy Taylor's and some pretty good beer there. I used to drink more whiskey. I don't drink a lot anymore, but I still do enjoy a good single malt. But mostly just in general, I tend to drink red wine most of the time now. It's, if you get a reasonable bottle of wine, it's going to be good. You can't go wrong.
There are some great new small breweries opening up in Leeds.
Well, yes.
Like Northern Monk, and I'm trying to think, there's one in Meanwood.
Mm-hmm.
There's something for you to sample when you're next in Yorkshire.
Well, yeah, I look forward to being over there again and sampling. My stepmother's still in Leeds, and we keep in touch by phone quite a lot. And touch wood, she's managed to avoid being ill, so she's in her 80s, which is good for her. It's but it's tough, not being able to be with family and everything. She's had a hard time of it.
Yeah, I think so, and it's, at least we're sort of starting to get to a point where we can open up a little bit more with like vaccines and things.
Yeah. There's got to be hope.
Yeah, we've always got to hope that. So Samantha says, have there been people in your life who've been a great help when it comes to research?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have some police friends. I mean, at first I didn't know anybody, so I just used to make it up or steal it from other police novels, and they probably made it up too, or stole it from someone else. So it's second, third hand information. But yeah, now because of that, I've had occasional emails from police over the years saying, "Oh, you got that wrong. We wouldn't do that." And my response has always been, "Oh, well, tell me how you would do it. I'd like to get it right." So I have made some good friends who've. Problem is that they're so good at their jobs that they may have started out as detective inspectors or whatever, but they've gone way up now. So they're all, chief constables and things, and they're not a great deal of use anymore when it comes to investigations because they don't do any. They're mostly in charge of things. So it's I don't know enough of the lower ranks, the people who actually do the interviewing and arrest the suspects and, you know, and do all of the legwork. That's the problem. But I try and leave most of that out and concentrate, you know, not so much on the forms you have to fill in and, you know, the exact procedures you have to follow, but on the characters and the interaction and the drama, the interesting stuff.
Do you do the same with like the forensic kind of aspect as well? Do you have like a forensic person that you speak to? And
Well, yes, you have to. I mean, there's so much, you know, advances in forensic science. And since I started, I mean, really, if you look back to my first books, they're sort of like historical novels. You know, the first one was written in the early 80s. Well, there's little or no use of computers, DNA analysis. There's no CCTV everywhere. It's, you know, it's just another world. But these days, you can't overlook that kind of stuff because people will know if you did. You have somebody coming out of a car park having just murdered someone. Well, wouldn't it be on CCTV? And then you have to find a way of, well, yes, it was on CCTV, but the camera was working very badly. I mean, I've had to do that to some extent in Not Dark Yet with something that's filmed. And I've talked to enough, you know, police about CCTV and surveillance footage, and they say half the time you wouldn't even recognize your own mother. So I feel quite justified in sort of doing that down. But you can't not mention it. You know, that's the problem.
yeah, I was going to say you're quite inventive at sort of saying, well, it's there and they get bits, but there's, you know, you can't make out this or like can't enhance it enough or
Yeah, it's like mobile phones. I mean, that's another thing. You know, people are always in touch now, whereas they could used to wander off, you wouldn't know where they were. But now, you know, you can always find out by pinging and whatever. The only good thing about, you know, well, one of the really good things about Yorkshire is that there are plenty of places where the phone doesn't work. So, yeah, you've got one and it's covered, but it just is out of range. So you can't get in touch with someone.
uh, there's another question here of how would you describe Banks to a new reader?
Well, it's difficult because he's developed so much over the 27 books that, you know, when I started out with him, I started him as, I wanted a sort of ordinary everyman sort of character, somebody that most people could identify with. And one of the things that has always struck me about police officers that I do know and have become friends with is that how rich their lives are outside the job. That, you know, one of my good friends, the police, he ran a unit in Toronto. He collected old Roman coins and first edition Dickens, and, you know, so there's all this stuff beyond just the working out of the crimes and the bossing people around and the police talk that you hear on television. That, you know, these were real people with real interests, real lives, real dreams. So that's how I started with Banks, and he was sort of an ordinary bloke. He liked music. He was not unintelligent, but he didn't have a university education. Married, two young kids, had enough of life down in London, moved up for a quieter life in Yorkshire. Didn't get it, of course. Well, now, you know, after so many books, he's divorced, living alone, drinking too much, a bit depressed, a bit miserable, but he's come there honestly, you know, over the years. He's lived his life and he's had a lot of interesting experiences, both on the job and in his personal life. So it would be impossible really to sum him up very easily because he's a fairly complex character and he's a character that, say, has changed over 20, 30 years, over 30 years writing about him. So start at the beginning, and the Banks you get in Gallows View is not quite the same person you read about in Not Dark Yet.
Yeah. How do you keep track of all those? Because you've got such a wonderful world of characters in there. There's not just Banks, is there? There's like Ray and Annie and all of those other sort of characters are really rich and detailed. How do you keep track of them across such a sort of span of books and years?
Well, mostly just up there, and I have the books. I mean, I always have the books with me so that I can. Oh, I know I mentioned him in this book and this page, and so I'll just go and look it up, you know, in a copy of the book, and that's the best, really. I now that most of my books are in some form on the computer, I can do a search for a name, say, okay, I know Annie met this character in this book, or you know, Banks was in Tallinn and Watch in the Dark, so this scene must be in there, and I can usually find it. But it's as easy to flip through the book and find it as it is to do it on the computer. So it's just a matter of searching back for the scene where I'd said things about this character before. So when the character comes up in a later book, I can go back to the original description and A, not repeat it, you know, word for word, but B, use it as a basis for anything I say in the future. So it's all a bit of hunt and peck, really.
Because you must have quite a sort of long-running fans of the books that will pick up on kind of details.
Oh, they know better than I do. I mean, I get emails, you know, you said this, and yeah, I mean, I make mistakes. Of course I do. We all do. And I have plenty of fans who are willing to tell me what they are.
Fair enough. Probably in a kind way, though, hopefully.
Oh, usually in a very nice way, for which I'm most grateful. You know, the worst it gets is kind of, I caught you, you know. To which my response is usually, well, congratulations, you spotted the deliberate mistake. I put one in every book just for people like you.
That's a good response.
But no, most of them are very nice about it.
So we've got a comment here that says, we have an Ask the Expert coming up. So we, to help our authors, we've got about 500 member authors. We do Ask the Experts with sort of our police members and forensic scientists. We've got one coming up with a forensic scientist. She said, are there any tricky forensic issues in your upcoming novel?
Well, there is, there is, for example, a fire in which there are burned bodies, which I think are always difficult to write about. And I understand from everything I've read and from fire investigators that I've talked to, it's often very difficult to you know, to ascertain the information you'd like to get from these things. It's not always possible. So, you know, the stage to which the burning has gone, the state of the remains is very iffy. So yeah, that was a tricky one that took quite a bit of time. I was fortunate enough that my my stepbrother was a firefighter, is now retired, and introduced me to a fire scene investigator who proved invaluable in a couple of books.
Is there anything you've ever researched that made you feel a little bit sick?
Yeah, burned bodies. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, because you're writing it, there's a bit of a sense of detachment, you know, that I suppose I would be the one to realize most of all that it's not real because I'm making it up. So by all rights, I shouldn't make myself sick. But yeah, I mean, there are certain things that turn your stomach a little bit, and some of often it's the details, you know, it's sort of like in Aftermath, the toes sticking up through the dirt like mushrooms, you know, make you just a little bit queasy. It's not the really gross stuff, it's the little details.
So we've got Wendy Jones, one of our author members, loved your answer about the response that you give to people who spot errors in your books. She said it's genius.
Yeah, well, it doesn't work really, you know, but as I say, it's not one that I need to use very often. So
And we've had a couple of similar questions from both my dad and Jason, who've asked, my dad's asked when will Banks retire, and Jason has asked when do you see sort of an end for the Banks series?
Yeah, it's something, of course, that I've thought about quite a lot, especially over the past few books, and especially when my friends Ian Rankin, Mike Connolly have been retiring their detectives and then bringing them back in a different capacity and then reinstating them and not knowing what the hell to do with them, to be honest. And I didn't want to be in that situation. You know, I didn't want to be in a situation of sort of killing him off and having to bring him back. So I thought if I really wanted to retire him, I should get him promoted to chief constable and marry Annie. And then there would be nothing else to write about. He would be happy and wouldn't be doing any investigating. But short of that, he does have to retire, and it's pretty close. So I think that what I'm going to do is take perhaps the most obvious route and have him retained as a consultant, cold cases, or what they call serious crimes review. In other words, looking at older cases that were not solved that are still open. So he would be working as a consultant, probably with the people he's working with now. You know, there's no point changing all of that. He wouldn't have his office and he wouldn't get paid as much. That would be the main difference. Plus, he'd be working kind of part-time on a, you know, case-by-case basis rather than constantly on a retainer. So that's probably what I'll do in the, you know, over the next 2 or 3 books.
So while there's a long-running series, one of the things I like to ask is, would you ever be tempted to sort of write any spin-off stories? Would you give Annie her own sort of novella or?
Yeah, I've thought of it. I haven't done it yet, and you know, it varies a little bit from book to book how big Annie's part is or Jerry's part. I think in some books, you know, in for example, Sleeping in the Ground, Jerry had a larger part than many of the others. Was more involved in solving the crime, and that's a natural balance. You know, it changes. In other books, it's been Winsome and Annie, but to actually write one in which they were the only character, you know, just Annie doing a case all by herself, I haven't done yet. And I'm not saying I won't. I mean, perhaps when, you know, Banks becomes a consultant, it would be the time to give, say, Annie a bit more prominence and Banks a little less prominence. But, you know, as I say, I don't plan all that in advance any more than I plan each book in advance. So it depends how I feel at the time.
I always love the authors who say they don't plan a lot in advance, and they're always ones that have the really intricate kind of plots that you can't imagine that someone can just kind of start off and write, especially when they're kind of overarching, like the 3 stories, this kind of 3-book series you've got here with Not Dark Yet.
Yeah, I mean, people like to think that we know where we're going when we start, you know, as the most of the guidebooks say you should. But in my experience, and most of my crime writer friends, we talk about this stuff, and most of us take the same approach, you know, as I've just been talking about. We just wing it. I mean, it may surprise you to know, you know, that all these big names that you think work it all out in advance don't, for the most part. I know a couple who do. I mean, a couple of very, very intricate plotters who have it all worked out in advance and write beautiful books. And in some ways, it doesn't really matter, does it? How we do it, as long as we do it.
No, it just amazes me. It makes me more in awe when you read something that's so intricate and there's like so many interwoven threads, and you know that the author's just kind of done it without that intricate plot.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a matter of having an open mind. And when you're writing, I find some of my best ideas come not when I'm thinking about what I want to write, but when I'm actually writing. And if I've got it already plotted out what I'm going to write, there's not as much room for that to happen. Although I do know from talking to, you know, people who do plot quite heavily that they're still open to new ideas as they work. So, you know, either way you do it, you're not going to have a closed mind if an idea comes and bites you on the ass.
So Wendy wants to know if you have any other series in mind. So once you've finished Banks, would you write any other series? Would you start another one with fresh characters?
Oh, I'm too old to write another one. Oh no, the idea of, you see, I had no idea that Banks was going to go on for for so long. When I first started, I thought maybe 3 or 4 books, and then I'd do standalone thrillers or crime novels. It just didn't work out that way, and I'm still happy writing about Banks. But the idea of starting a new series, I know that quite a lot of writers do them. I mean, Anne Cleeves has just started a relatively new series with a new detective. But I think that what I would do if I slow down on Banks a little bit would be to write more standalones, because I do really enjoy doing that. It's harder work because you have to invent all the characters from scratch. It's like reinvent the wheel each time. Whereas with the Banks books, there's a little laid down already that you can build on. But it's exciting, to do something different, especially something historical that sort of goes back to, whether it's Second World War or even the sort of 60s is historical now.
So has Banks been such a long series by kind of popular demand?
Yeah, it's been a nice balance, really, because I've enjoyed doing them and people have enjoyed reading them. Now, you have to realize, though, that the first, really up until In a Dry Season, which would be the first 9 books in the series, were, hardly earth-shattering in their sales or in attracting fans. Most people here had hardly heard of me before In a Dry Season. And I always find it interesting when I meet somebody at a literary event that started with Gallows View. There aren't many of them here or over there or in the States. I mean, it wasn't until my 4th book I got published in the States. So, yeah, it's and I wanted to write about Banks. So pretty much throughout the 90s, I was barely keeping my head above water in terms of sales and publishers. I was dumped a couple of times. I found it hard to get another publisher. I was hanging on by a thread. And then, say, at the end of the 90s came In a Dry Season, and Macmillan, were the ones who published that in the UK, actually saw something in it and, put some money into promoting it. And after that, I were able to build up and, went through Aftermath and various other books that got more and more readers. So it was not exactly an overnight success.
I think sometimes the slow builds, they're probably harder for you, but then like you build a real sort of fan base that grows you from that.
And
you
show,
liked it from the beginning.
Yeah, you show that you've got a little bit of staying power. And I'm grateful to the publishers who kept me above water for all those years. It was not easy for them either, but things have changed a little bit. And I think for a lot of new writers today, I feel quite sorry for them. If they don't make it within 2 or 3 books, they may well get dumped. And, if people had judged me on my first 2 or 3 books in sales, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you now. As you say, sometimes you need a bit more than 3 big books to grab an audience.
Yeah, I'm thinking one of my other favorite authors is Ellie Griffiths. And I've
Ellie's great. Yeah.
I remember going to meet her in Leeds Waterstones, and there was like very few other people there. Like we could talk to her for about an hour at the signing table on her own. And now she's like gets a big audience and things. But
yeah, she probably won't talk to me anymore. No, she's great as Ellie. Last time I saw her was at one of those Morecambe and Vice things, I think. But yeah, she's done incredibly well. But yeah, but you know, she's written quite a few books as well. Another not overnight success.
Yeah, but it proves that it's worth sticking with it. And Sam says, other than Wing It, is there a piece of advice that yourself and author friends have found worked for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't actually recommend that anybody else wing it. I'd say, you know, do an outline and make sure you know where you're going before you start, or you'll kick yourself at some point. Yeah, I mean, the main thing, it comes back to what Ed McBain said to me years ago. He said, put your bum on the chair and your fingers on the keyboard. You know, the only way to be a writer is to write. And it's one thing that all the books about writing tell you: try and do something every day. It's not easy, especially if you have a job, children, and, you know, a life. It's not easy, but if you really want to do it, you have to actually sit and write. I mean, I've taught a lot of writing courses, and I've met a lot of people who want to be writers, but they don't really want to write. Might sound strange, but there are people like that. And another thing is read a lot. You know, a guy who in one of my courses sort of said, you wanted to write a thriller, learn how to write a thriller. I said, oh, who's your favorite thriller writer? He says, well, I haven't actually read any, you know, but I want to write one. Yeah. So, yeah, so read a lot and write a lot. It's pretty basic, isn't it?
It's still good advice. Sometimes basic.
Yeah, it works. It actually works.
And then the final question, and it's one of our group's favorite questions, is we like to ask about people's memorable moments as an author.
Oh, well, you should have given me a bit of time to think of something there. I could have made something up. I mean, you know, it's obviously moments when you win an award are memorable, but they pass fairly quickly. And I've been there to lose more often than I've been there to win. And that's sometimes bad reviews are more memorable than good ones. But I think really, for me, it's been the journeys to faraway places and to find, for example, that my publisher sent me to South Africa to do a book tour, and I meet people right down in South Africa, read my books. And, you know, that never ceases to amaze me. Or Australia, New Zealand. And I do hope I get to all those places again, you know, because I've always loved going there. And you're not there for long, and it's mostly work, but you get a bit of sightseeing, and I love to travel. But also just to meet the people from completely different places in the world that are united through reading my books is a huge thrill. And along the same lines, really similar lines, a number of people say that, you know, my books have got them through difficult times, whether illness, grief, loss of a loved one. And that's very moving. I always find that, you know, if you can do something that I suppose gives people enough of an escape from some of the horrors of life, including the ones at the moment, then you've done something good. And that's always lifts my heart to hear something like that.
So that's a much better answer than if you'd have just made something up. Thank you so much for that. Is there any events that you would really look forward to going back to when we can travel again?
Yeah, all of them, you know. I mean, I live a very sheltered life, even when it's not locked down. I mean, we writers live a very isolated, lonely life in a lot of ways. So when they let us out, you know, once a year when the book comes out, we have fun, and it's just great to go do a UK tour and go around the Independents, Waterstones, and talk to the audiences. And yeah, so if they want me to go to South Africa or Australia again, I'm gone. Wonderful. It'd be great. Just want to go somewhere.
I look forward to you coming back over. It's not as glamorous as Australia and South Africa.
I'll definitely be in Leeds. I never miss Leeds.
be amazing to see you in Leeds again. Thank
I'll
you
be
so
there.
much for joining us. There's a few comments on here saying that your answers are brilliant. Someone else said thank you, and Sam finishes it better than I could even say. She said, thank you so much for a wonderful hour. She loved the answer about the power of books and the escape they provide.
Well, it's true. Yeah, it is true. For me too, they do. You know, I love reading. That's how I started writing.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a great pleasure.